Good morning. We would like to welcome you to our session where we're going to be discussing program review essentials and the top 10 compliance findings. We know that this is the fourth day and a lot has been covered, so we really appreciate you coming in to share with us as a family, because that's what we are, a family. We're a community that serve one purpose, and that is to ensure that students are able to get the financial aid that they need in order to continue their education. My name is Cassandra Weems, and I am delighted to be presenting with you today with our panelists, Vinita Simpson, Angelique James, and John Finkelstein. I am an institution improvement specialist, and our panelists are institution review specialists. I work with schools on compliance visits, initial applications, technical assistance, new school visits. Our panelists, they go out and conduct program reviews with the institutions and making sure that the institutions are in compliance. May I also tell you that they all have worked with compliance audits as well. There are two parts to this presentation. The first part, we will be going over the program review process. The second part, our panelists will cover the compliance audits for program review and the audit section. Some little details I'm supposed to tell you that at the end, the evaluations will be emailed to you after the conference, and after we finish the presentation, we will entertain questions at that time. So much for the intros. Let us get into the presentation. Most of the content that I'm going to cover directly comes from the 2009 Program Review Guide for institutions, which you can find on IFAP. May I also let you know that a new program review guide is in the works, and it should be available this winter. There's also information about program reviews in Volume 2, Chapter 8 of the FSA Handbook. By a show of hands, how many of you have had a program review conducted at your institution? Okay, quite a few of you. Well, for the rest of you, we haven't forgot about you. Don't worry. We still want you to be a part of the family. What is a program review? I'm glad you asked. A program review is a way that the department checks to ensure schools are adhering to compliance requirements and determine if an institution is financially solvent and administratively capable of administering the Title IV programs. We look at students' academic and financial aid records, the business office ledgers and account statements, and sometimes we might have to interview students and staff. But don't worry about the interviewing. That might be a way for you to get additional staff if you're understaffed. We also look at consumer information. You know, that's a top priority for the department right now, so we also review all of consumer information. The program review process may involve suggesting corrective actions that may help improve future institutional compliance. You should make sure that you're prepared for a program review. You should ensure that your files are in order. You should reconcile each month. Keep a clear audit trail within your financial and business office. And I can't stress it enough how important it is to have your files in order. Periodically, you need to complete an internal file review. That will also help you to be prepared for a program review. You should stay abreast of regulatory guidance, attend training such as this, check the regulatory guidance that comes out on IFAP. So as long as you are compliant, you will not have to worry when we gracefully show up at your institution. Why are program reviews conducted? Because the law requires them to be conducted. Program reviews are written into the law. It's important to ensure that Title IV continues to help students complete their post-secondary education. It also serves as a mechanism to ensure that Title IV is properly administered to protect all of us taxpayers. Who conduct program reviews? Well, as you know, the Department of Education is a large organization. Federal student aid is one element under ED that have employees in 8 regional offices and our headquarter offices in DC. Program compliance is one of the business units within FSA. The School Eligibility Service Group, which we refer to as SESG, is a division within program compliance. There are 8 school participation divisions, or what we call SPDs, that's under SESG. The SPD is responsible for formalizing a program review team for review, and that team can consist of 2 or 3 individuals. It just depends on the scope of the review. Each SPD has institution review specialists that perform a number of functions, such as resolving compliance audits, processing eligibility actions, providing technical assistance, conducting program reviews, and as that line item, as other duties as assigned that we all can relate to. How are institutions selected? School personnel are always curious and ask us how are they selected or wanted to know what caused them to be selected for a program review. The law specifies the priorities for selecting institution for program reviews. The visits could derive from high default rates, higher than 25%, significant increases and decreases in Title IV expenditures that cannot be explained, deficiencies reported by an oversight agency such as your state or accrediting agency, could be high withdrawal rates. Some other red flags are deficient audits, knowledge of fraud and abuse, complaints from students or staff, exceeding the 90-10 ratio for proprietary institutions, and reconciliation issues. Each SPD uses a case management system to determine if a program review is warranted. It could be that the school just needs a compliance or technical assistant visit. When preparing for a program review, you will always be notified in writing of an on- and off-site program review. The scope will be either a general assessment or a focus. The review typically consists of 1 week. Records reviewed usually are from the current award year and the most recently completed award year. It depends on the timing and the focus of the program review. For advanced reviews, the president and the financial aid director will be contacted via telephone 30 days from the program review with a follow-up in writing of additional information. Officials will be notified the day of the review for short notice and unannounced reviews. These are less common. It's usually associated with fraud or abuse or complaints. It is the responsibility of the institution to contact your third-party servicer so that they may have all the documentation that the reviewers will need to review when they arrive at your institution. Reviewers may request information in advance of the visit of the review, before the review, so they can look at that documentation because it's a lot of documentation that they will have to review throughout that week, so they might want to get a jump start. School officials must respond to the announcement letter and be sure to follow the instructions to protect personally identifiable information, which we refer to as PII. PII must be password protected if you're sending it electronically, or if you're mailing it, it must be double wrapped. The program review begins with the entrance conference. Introductions, roles, and responsibilities are identified for ED and school staff. The reasons for the program review may or may not be disclosed. We will usually explain if it's a general or a focus review and which award years are being looked at. The scope may expand during the review, and additional information may be requested depending on the information reviewed in the student files. The time frame for submitting documentation to reviewers will be provided. Typically, the time frame for the exit meeting is scheduled at the entrance conference. Staff will be presented with the student sample list with the required documentation that must be provided to the reviewers, such as the ICER, verification documents, ledger, transcript, academic files, etc. It's the same information I'm sure that your auditors look at when they come and conduct your compliance audits at your institution. The staff should document that the reviewers are looking at the student files to be in compliance with FERPA. It should be, you can do your own form, or you can do the form that's in Appendix E in the program review guide. The entrance conference works the same way for off-site reviews as it does for on-site. The only difference is that you will have to electronically send the documentation or mail the information to the reviewers. Some of these items listed on this slide can be looked at before or after the review. You are required to provide unrestricted and timely access to requested documentation to the reviewers while they're on site at your institution. Schools must have policies and procedures in place. Policies we think of as a statement of intent. For example, the financial aid staff will complete verification prior to dispersing Title IV aid. Procedures are steps required to consistently meet that policy. The financial aid office will inform the bursar or business office upon completion of student verification to prepare for dispersing Title IV aid to students. Remember the 3 criteria that must be met to award Title IV aid. The school has to be an eligible institution, there must be an eligible program, and an eligible student. Critical elements are tested to ensure compliance with federal regulations. Non-compliance may result in further testing to determine if it is an isolated or systemic problem, or if it's just negligence on the school's part. An eligible institution has to have the state and accreditor approvals. You have to be an eligible location. Any ineligible locations can result in significant liabilities. Administrative capability requires schools to have knowledgeable staff, and prior audits are checked as well to ensure that the school are following their corrective action plans as it relate to the findings that were in the audit. Program eligibility is outlined in 34 CFR 6688 and Volume 2 of Chapter 2 of the FSA Handbook. Programs have to meet the guidelines set forth by ED to be eligible. Consumer information is, you can check on the FSA assessment site on IFAP and review all the consumer information requirements and consumer information at a glance. Campus security, you must have internal policies and procedures. Distribution of the campus security report must be provided to staff and students annually, and John will cover that area when he discusses that finding. Financial responsibility is noted in 66815 of the Code Federal Regulation book. You must be current on debt payments, have separation of duties between awarding and dispersing financial aid. You have to make sure that the institution is financially healthy. The fiscal review, it consists of cash management, timely refunds, federal funds in an account, making sure that that account is designated as a federal account. Examination of draws and returns in G5 will be looked at. And the FSA will be checked for accuracy based on the information that was supplied to ED. The review of student critical elements starts way before the program review begins and possibly will not end until after the site visit. Student element reviewers look at eligibility issues, which are C codes, making sure that they're resolved, the high school diploma or equivalent, if your policy requires it, and citizenship. Attendance records, the clock hour schools, you have to ensure that students have completed the actual hours in the payment period before the next disbursement. We'll make sure that the cost of attendance is accurate, ensure that there's no overaward or need-based aid. Check credit balances to make sure that the credit balances have been returned to the student within the 14 days, or if you have an authorization on file. Look at enrollment status. Ensure that Title IV aid award is based on enrollment status, if that student is full-time, half-time, or three-quarter time. Check professional judgment documentation. If you've made a professional judgment, then ensure that that documentation is in the student files. Return to Title IV, we look at that to make sure that it's calculated correctly. If there was a post-withdrawal disbursement documented. SAP, we look at the transcript versus your SAP policy to ensure that you're following your policies as it relates to the warning, appeal, and probation. Verification, making sure that it has been completed and that it's adequate documentation in the file. Calculations and disbursement, checking, making sure that aid was calculated correctly. Confirm entrance and exit counseling to make sure that it's documented for loan recipients. Here are some things we look at during the review. Admission records, checking to see if signed enrollment agreements are in the files, the admission application, or high school diplomas. Academic transcripts, SAP, attendance records. Financial aid, we'll look at the ICERs, verification, award letter, and all the other elements that I just mentioned. Check the ledgers, making sure that the record of charges and credits are on the ledger, making sure that the disbursements are there, and checking to make sure the credit balances, again, if they have been dispersed to the student within the 14 days. And as reviewers, we like to, tell the school that it's good if they would have a running total balance on their ledgers, so that way you won't have to explain, and it'll be clear to the reviewers when they're looking at it, because if you can't explain the transactions, then it could cause the institution to have liabilities. The information is compared to information in the department database systems. NSLDS, we'll look at to make sure that there's no defaults or overpayments. Look at the enrollment status reporting, making sure it's timely and correct. Making sure students have not went over their Pell LEU or exceeded the direct loan 150%. Check COD, we compare disbursement dates to ledger dates. Ensure the amounts are correct. Look at the loan periods and the academic years. The timeliness of reporting within the 15 days of return to Title IV to ensure that it's been submitted within that 45-day requirement. The CPS will look for eligibility issues such as the C codes and citizenship. Make sure Pell is paid off of the correct ICER transaction. Reviewers may interview students and staff, as I stated previously, and school officials cannot dictate who will be in that in the interview process. The exit conference is generally conducted when the field work is substantially completed. The reviewers will explain the preliminary findings. Review may require school to take corrective action as soon as possible and not wait for the program review report. And this is normally done when they identify systemic issues. Reviewers may ask you to identify students impacted by findings as it relates to return to Title IV, SAP, or verification. Documents requested late in the program review process usually need to be provided within 1 week after the reviewers have left your institution. Areas of liability may be identified. The school may begin payments immediately prior to the program review report, but just remember that if you do this, the findings may not be appealed if the liabilities are paid in advance. The next steps could require reviewers to further analyze data gathered during the visit. There are 3 possible outcomes from a program review. Additional documentation will be requested, or an expedited determination letter may be issued in lieu of a program review report, or you will receive a program review report. Let's look at these. Reviewers typically allow schools 30 days from the date of a request for additional information to provide for required documentation. There are 3 possible outcomes if the school fails to provide this requested documentation. The reviewers will come back and visit your institution to look at that documentation. The program review report may include the findings that would have been omitted had you provided the documentation, or failure to provide documentation may be included as a finding which would display a lack of administrative capability. If the documentation is not provided, it could be grounds for referral to our Administrative Actions and Appeals Schools Group, which we refer to as AAASG for administrative action. This is the outcome every school hopes for, and our reviewers like this expedited determination letter as well, because they don't like writing long reports. There's no more than you like receiving those reports with all the findings. The EDL is issued when there are no findings or only minor findings that are non-systemic, or the findings were corrected prior to issuance of the EDL, or liabilities were paid or collected prior to the issuance of the EDL. If a program review report is issued, the report is usually issued within 75 days of the conclusion of the program review visit and will contain findings identified, even those the school was allowed to resolve prior to the report. Some of the standard sections here are self-explanatory. The scope of the review and disclaimer will state what type of review it was and disclaim that the information is not inclusive. Some findings can still be identified after the review, and sometimes that happens. The reviewers can have the exit conference and go through some of the findings with you that they found while they were on site, but then when they get back to the office and they go back through all that documentation, they could come up with some additional findings that were not disclosed to you at the exit conference. The preliminary findings will be disclosed, and the school will be informed what actions to take to rectify the finding. The reviewers may provide some recommendations that can help staff administer the Title IV programs better if warranted. School personnel will have an opportunity to respond to each finding in writing within 30 to 90 days, depending on the complexity of the findings and/or file reviews. All the findings in the report must be addressed, and backup documentation has to be provided. The due date will be specified in the cover letter. The school can disagree with any of the program review report conclusions. An adequate explanation must be provided. Document required actions may require you to correct your policy or procedure, correct a student-specific error, or complete a file review. An extension can be requested with good cause. If you need more time, you would have to explain why the response can't be completed by the due date and provide a percentage that you've already completed so far, or an auditor engagement letter if requested. If an extension is granted, a new due date will be given. If the school responds timely, no further action will be required. The final program review determination letter, which we refer to as the FPRD, serves to inform the school of final findings and any resulting liabilities. It identified the finding by the number, and if the finding is closed or resolved. The staff will need to follow the repayment instructions if a liability is identified. A copy will be furnished to your state authorizing agency as well as your accreditor. The FPRD is subject to FOIA, but the student-specific information will not be released. It may or may not result in further action. Further actions might require disbursement adjustments in COD or G5 adjustments or payment of liabilities. The FPRD closeout letter is issued after a school responds to the FPRD. It's not issued if the institution files an appeal for any finding. If you're appealing a finding with liabilities, you will need to file it within 45 days of receiving the FPRD. You will not pay any liability while you're under appeal. You can see the program review guide for details regarding this process. So that kind of wraps up the process of a program review. So don't hyperventilate when we send you a letter saying that we're going to do a program review at your institution. Because remember, what did I say in the beginning? We are family, and family feel comfortable with each other, right? Okay. Now that I reviewed this, the program review process, we will look at the top 10 findings, compliance findings as it relates to the program review and audit. Vinita, Angelique, and John, they're ready to talk about some of these findings with you. And the findings are listed by number of occurrences, not by liabilities. So let's look at some of the findings. Schools that participate in FSA programs are required to complete a compliance audit, independent compliance audit, have it completed by your auditor. And it depends on your institution. It might be a FSA audit or a 133. As you can see, in the number one spot is repeat finding. You know, we always tell institutions, going back to what I said earlier about the corrective action when they look at the audits. So you must do your due diligence when it concerns this finding to avoid administrative actions from ED. The new finding that made the list is improper origination of direct loans. School officials must ensure students meet the borrower eligibility requirements that's stated in 34 CFR 685-200 before originating a direct loan. The correct student data must be provided. The crime awareness finding for program review made it to the number one spot from the number 5 last year. You know, you want to make sure that you check out that consumer information at a glance and ensure that you meet all the requirements as it relates to crime awareness and that you have policies and procedures in place for that. In the last 2 years, we've had findings that were tied. This year, all the findings stand alone. All the findings on the top 10 program review list were on the list last year. They just in different order. These findings appeared on both the audit and the program review list. This could possibly mean that corrective actions are not being implemented. So I will now turn it over to Vinita, our first panelist, to discuss the first 3 findings with you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cassandra. Good morning, everyone. I know that you've had plenty of time to sit out there and look at our faces, and you were thinking to yourself, wow, they look just alike, right? Well, if you thought that, you might want to borrow your neighbor's glasses, because just like we differ in faces, we also differ in our program review style. We have regulations and procedures that we have to follow, just like you do. But just like every financial aid director may run their office a little different, our style of conducting program reviews is a little different. When you walked through the door, you probably had some ideas, some things you may have heard about program reviewers. But I will tell you one thing that you can walk away with today is that now you have met 3 program reviewers that actually really desire to help the schools. Even though the situation that we meet may not be on the best terms, we also want to make sure that we're doing whatever we can to give you the information that you need to become compliant and do what's best for our students. So let's get started with the first finding. Let's talk about verification violations. Everyone knows what verification is. And while we understand that verification is something that every school deals with, we understand human error. With human error, here are some things that we can actually do to help prevent this finding. As reviewers, when we get to your school, we probably already know which students we're going to select and which students are going to be selected for verification. So when we ask for a student file, make sure that you have that file in order, as Cassandra has stressed. Make sure all the information that you need to show that you've properly and completely conducted the verification is in the student file. With verification, we see everything from missing documentation, incomplete or incorrect verification, and conflicting information. So one thing you want to make sure of is that when you are looking at your verification, even though it may not be a verifiable item, there could still be conflicting information that you need to resolve. So anything that you have in that file could cause some type of conflicting information. So what are some things that you can do to help in this process? Regulations change from year to year. Please make sure that you stay current. The department works really hard provides a lot of information. Make sure that you use it. The FSA assessment is a great tool for you to review for verification. The May 4th, 2016 electronic announcement gives you the tax transcript matrix that is very helpful for schools when they're doing the verification and using tax transcripts. I would also make sure that you review the Federal Student Aid Handbook, the little Bible you have on your desk, and review the application and verification guide in there. You also want to resolve your conflicting information, make sure that you are training your staff. Checklists are always helpful, and make sure that you develop policies and procedures that are current with the regulations and the award year for the student. Let's go on to the next finding. Credit balance deficiency finding. The regulation states that whenever a school disperses Title IV funds by crediting a student's account for Title IV, those funds for any tuition and fees and other allowable charges, those funds that result in a credit balance must be given to the student or the parent as soon as possible, but no later than 14 days. When we get to your school and look at the student account ledgers, we want to see clearly where the funds have been dispersed, where the credit balance has been created, and where the credit balance has been resolved. We stress chronological running balances, making it easy for the reviewers to see when all of these things have occurred. Many times on the review, we will actually see when the credit balance has not been resolved at all, or when it has been resolved late. So to help prevent this, you want to make sure that you have a clear process in place for when the funds pay and when the credit balance is created and resolved. You want to make sure that you train across the departments. Remember that this process does not just include financial aid. It may also include your business office. Develop and implement policies that stay current again with all the regulations. Keep in mind that the cash management regulations that were effective July 1st, 2016, now prohibit schools from using student authorization forms. These are only for the schools that are on heightened cash monitoring 1 and 2. I know you've heard of HCM 1 and 2, so the schools that are on HCM 1 and 2 can no longer use authorization forms to hold credit balances. So make sure that you have updated your policies and procedures for that. The next finding we will discuss is the R2T4 funds made late finding. I'm going to read something that's going to help you understand how important this finding is. Failure to make required R2T4 payments demonstrates a lack of administrative capability and constitutes a violation of the regulation. In addition, Congress considers the failure of an institution to pay required refunds to be a very serious matter. Failure to make refunds can subject the individual failing to do so to criminal penalties. Who wants that? After hearing that, it may be surprising, but we actually have schools that complete their R2T4 calculations and decide not to return the funds. Please don't be one of those. It is best for schools to have a monitoring and reporting system that will make sure that you are completing your R2T4s timely so that you can complete your refunds within the 45 days allowed. When we review the student files, we'll carefully review your R2T4 calculations, your student account ledgers, and COD to make sure that the complete process has been done within your 45 days. This is also another area where communication is key across departments, and this one could be all the departments on your campus to make sure that your withdrawals and your R2T4s are being completed correctly. In certain situations regarding this finding, a school may be required to remit what is called a letter of credit. Some know of it as an LOC. While we hope this is never something for your institution, the more you know, the better. So an LOC is a financial instrument issued by a financial institution, which is usually a bank, that moderates the risk of a school that is not in compliance with the regulatory standards, but yet still allows the school to continue to participate in Title IV, giving them an opportunity to get in compliance. So now I will turn it over to Angelique James.
Thank you. Good morning. Before I start, I'm curious to see if there are any schools in here where I, John, Vinita, or even Cassandra have conducted a program review at their institution. We usually have a few. One, okay. And it was an awesome experience, wasn't it? Great. We did pay him before the session started, so. All right, let's discuss NSLDS roster reporting, inaccurate and untimely. This is a hot topic with the department, as you well know and well aware of. We had, I think, 3 or 4 sessions about NSLDS reporting and hands-on. So it's a hot topic with NSLDS. And lately, this finding, we see it. It was on the list for top audit finding and top program review finding. I believe the last 8 program reviews I've been on have had this finding. So you want to make sure you understand NSLDS reporting and that it's compliant. Now let's look at why reporting accurately and timely is key. Number 1, it protects the rights of borrowers by ensuring that loan interest subsidies are based on accurate enrollment data. It ensures loan payment dates are accurately based on the last date of attendance, or LDA. It allows in-school deferments to be automatically granted in NSLDS. And lastly, it provides a vast amount of critical data about the effectiveness of Title IV programs to the department, including completion data. Now, what are the timely requirements? Beginning July 1st, 2014, NSLDS began sending a roster file electronically to your school or its designated servicer every 60 days or more frequently, depending on your schedule, through your SAIG mailbox. Your school or servicer must certify the information and return the roster file within how many days of receiving it? 15 days, the new requirements. You must report enrollment changes within 30. However, if a roster file is expected within 60 days, you may provide the updated data on that roster file. Now, by a show of hands, how many schools currently use a servicer to report enrollment data to NSLDS? Okay, a majority of you guys. Okay, I have a question for you. Is it a finding for a school if they timely report to their servicer enrollment data, however, the servicer does not report timely to NSLDS? Oh, you guys, you've been to the other sessions, okay. Yes, it is, and unfortunately, when we go on reviews, a lot of schools are unaware of this. Dear Colleague Letter Gen 14.07 notifies schools that use of a third-party enrollment servicer does not relieve the school of its responsibility to adhere to all NSLDS enrollment reporting requirements. Now, for timeliness, what are we looking at as a reviewer? We're going to look at the length of time between the effective date, which is the date that the enrollment action took place, and the certified date, which is the date that the school certified the enrollment action. That length of time should be no more than 60 days. We'll also look at, does the student's LDA conflict with either the attendance records or the transcripts? Are changes in enrollment status updated? Is the student's enrollment accurate? If the student is taking more than 12 credit hours, does it show less than half time in NSLDS? Now, one big solution to prevent this, especially if you're using a servicer, is you want to make sure that a member of your school has an FSA user ID with online enrollment capabilities to make immediate enrollment updates to the NSLDS FAP website. All right, let's talk about the next finding, SAP policy not adequately developed or monitored. Now, we all know there are 2 major components of SAP that we look at. We look at if you have an effective policy and are you monitoring it. Now, the program integrity regulations published on October 29, 2010, and made effective July 1, 2011, changed SAP completely. Now, when going on reviews, when looking at your policy, we look at failure to include pace of completion, maximum time frame, or how your student can reestablish aid eligibility. That must be in your policy. We also see findings for not having all of the components. Your policy must explain how grade point average or GPA and pace of completion are affected by course incompletes, repetition, transfer credits from other universities, or changes in major. You also must make sure that your SAP policy is as strict or stricter than your academic policy. Also, not having the correct terminology. For example, if you have financial aid warning, you want to make sure you call it financial aid warning and not financial aid monitoring. You must use the exact terminology that is in the regulations. Probation should be called probation and not stipulation or academic discharge. Now, if you have an effective policy, you want to make sure you're monitoring it correctly. Some examples that we see on reviews are schools not requiring students to successfully appeal before placing them on probation, or inadequate appeal reasons or not having enough appeal documentation. For an example, if a school is requiring a student to have a mitigating or extenuating circumstance in order for the appeal to be approved, a student saying that he's working part-time and not able to maintain SAP is not a mitigating circumstance or extenuating circumstance, because as we all know, there are millions of students who work part-time and still can maintain SAP. I was one of them. So, an example of mitigating circumstance we all know would be a death in the family, an injury, or an illness. Also for appeals, schools sometimes forget that the student is also required to state what has changed in his or her situation that would allow him to make SAP for the next term. Now, some solutions to prevent this finding: making sure your appeal documentation is strong. The regulations do not tell us exactly what should be in your appeal documentation, but you want to make sure it's strong. I always tell schools the more documentation on an appeal, the better. You can use an SAP checklist for student files or store an SAP checklist in your system. And also conducting periodic random file reviews for SAP. You want to remember that SAP can result in very large liabilities, so you want to make sure you're compliant on this finding. The next finding we'll discuss is Pell Grant overpayment or underpayment. The first issue we see with schools is using the incorrect Pell formula. This usually happens with newer schools. We know there are 4 Pell Grant formulas, Formula 1, 2, 3, or 4. You want to make sure you're using the correct one. Incorrect calculations, proration. We usually see this with clock hour schools, where a clock hour school has a 1,500-hour clock hour program, and the Pell Grant is not prorated for the remaining portion that's less than an academic year. Incorrect EFC, or expected family contribution. For a change in a student's EFC, usually through verification, a Pell recalculation is always required. Incorrect number of weeks or hours. This is usually at a clock hour program as well. You want to make sure your program is set at the correct number of instructional weeks or clock hours. You can also look at your EAP and make sure that your program's institutional weeks and hours are not conflicting from your EAP. And remember, anytime you change your program's weeks or hours, you want to make sure you're checking back for Pell to make sure you're calculating that correctly. Now, change in enrollment status. This is the biggest reason we see this finding. Let's look at some of the Pell enrollment status calculation rules. For credit hour schools, if a student does not begin attendance in all classes within a term, a Pell recalculation is required. Also, a change in enrollment status between terms. If a student registers full-time for fall and spring term and completes the fall term, but then in the spring changes to half-time, a Pell recalculation would be required. Now, a change in enrollment status within a term That's an optional recalculations. I don't know of many schools who do this, but the regulations don't require any Pell recalculation changes in enrollment status after the student has begun attendance in all classes. However, your school can have a policy of recalculating an award, for example, after the drop add period. Just remember, if such a policy is established, it must be applied to all students consistently within that program. Now, for clock hour schools or non-term schools, a change in enrollment status, Pell recalculation is not required. The only exception to that is if in a non-term program, if the student's Pell Award is not reduced for part-time enrollment unless the student is less than half-time, in which case the student's cost of attendance must be adjusted. Now, some solutions to prevent this finding: you want to have documented awarding, disbursement, and proration policies and procedures. Establish internal controls and procedures to verify enrollment status before dispersing aid. I've gone on reviews where schools disperse full-time, 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 and then go back to see the student's actual enrollment status. You want to disperse verify enrollment status before dispersing aid. Conduct random file reviews. Use the correct Pell Grant schedule. And as always, train new staff and conduct annual training. All right, for the next 4 findings, I'll turn it over to John.
Good morning, I believe. Yes, morning, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces because I, too, was a financial aid director, and I certainly have a lot of empathy for what all financial aid directors do. I bring that with me to my program reviews, and we often have fun, interesting conversations about what goes on and strategies to cope and to move forward. So I also know that as a financial aid director, R2T4 calculations is one of the more complicated tasks that we perform. Not we, I'm not a we anymore, but that you perform. And that it is unfortunately a very common error in our program reviews. And given the fact that financial aid director might be running SAP, they might have a stack of R2T4s on their desk. I used to do the R2T4s myself, so I used to have a large stack. We had a lot of withdrawals. You're answering the phone, you're suspending a student, they might be sitting in your desk or in your office with crocodile tears while that stack of R2T4s is staring at you. So I understand exactly what all of you go through. Unfortunately, you still have to do the R2T4s correctly. So let's go ahead and then take a look at R2T4 calculation errors. The first error that I often see is that institutional charges are incorrect. At my school, we issued book vouchers. One of the issues is with the book charges. If students issued a book voucher and goes ahead and uses your campus bookstore for books and doesn't have a reasonable opportunity to purchase books at another site, you must include those book charges in your R2T4 calculation in the institutional charges section. I'm often seeing that schools do not include those charges. Also, in terms of the fees that school charges, you have to make sure that those fees are educationally related fees. I have seen in a couple of instances schools that include admissions fees in their in that section on the R2T4. Those admission fees cannot be there. In terms of the second bullet, actual clock hours used instead of scheduled hours, how many clock hour schools do I have here in the audience today? Okay, small portion, but let's talk about that briefly. As clock hour schools know, in terms of R2T4, it's all about the scheduled hours, not the actual hours. And scheduled hours can be derived, obviously, off of the enrollment agreement. If you have a part-time cosmetology student, for example, and they attend 4 days or 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, that's 20 scheduled hours. So you use those scheduled hours in the calculation of the amount of aid earned. Doesn't matter if they only attended 16 hours out of those 20 scheduled, they get credit for the full 20 scheduled hours. Actual hours obviously come into play when you're calculating when a student moves to the next payment period. So you want to make sure that you're using the correct scheduled hours and you're excluding any days that the student's not scheduled to attend, if there's a one-day administrative day, etc. At credit hour schools, there's a number of, I've seen a number of errors in the calculation of the number of days in a payment period. Now, chief among these are the exclusion of the break, the 5-day break. If you have within a standard term a break of 5 days or more, you have to exclude that break, and you also have to exclude the weekend before and the weekend after. So let's say that you have a spring break or you have a Thanksgiving break of 5 days or more. I'm seeing schools that don't exclude any days. I've seen schools that just exclude the 5 days and not the weekend. And I've seen a couple schools who exclude one weekend and not the other weekend. So you want to make sure that you're excluding those 9 days. Unfortunately, I've had several file reviews that I've required schools to go back and do that recalculation. Even though it's a small amount, it still has to be correct. You also want to make sure in a credit-based school that if you have a finals week, a standard finals week, that your payment period calculation starts on the first day of classes and ends on the end of finals week. You don't want to end the payment period on the last day of classes. All right, incorrect withdrawal date. This comes into play more often than not with unofficial withdrawals. Schools, as you know, you have the option to either use the midpoint on an unofficial withdrawal or the date of last attendance. A lot of schools choose to actually calculate and use that last date of attendance. They have instructors who report to financial aid or the registrar and actually inform those offices of the last date that a student attended. What we have found is that that's not documented well or that it's incorrect. So if you use that method to determine LDA, make sure, I would make sure that it's documented, either a screenshot from your system, an email from another staff member, etc. We're also finding for official withdrawals, schools that have used the actual day of processing rather than the day that the student notified them of their intent to withdraw. It's always the date of notification of the student's intent that you want to use as the LDA. At clock hour schools, another issue is clock hour schools use leave of absences rather frequently. If a student doesn't return from a leave of absence, the LDA goes back to the last day of attendance. I've had schools that actually use the LDA as the date that they found out they weren't returning. So that causes a problem with the R2T4 calculation. Finally, aid that could have been dispersed. If you include aid that could have been dispersed, let's say you just dispersed late in the term, but the student was eligible, the important point here is to make sure that the student was eligible at the time of withdrawal. You want to make sure that you have originated the loan through COD. You want to make sure that the promissory note has been signed, and if they had a C code, you want to make sure that that C code is resolved. So make sure that that student is eligible at the date of withdrawal if you include aid that could have been dispersed in the calculation. All right, for solutions to R2T4 calculation errors, obviously you want to do a quality control check in your office. Let's say your associate director does the R2T4s or the bursar does the R2T4s. You might want to pull a representative sample, 10 or 20 of those. Make sure they're correct, make sure they're timely. R2T4 late was discussed earlier. That's also a fairly significant issue. So do that quality control check. This area, probably more than any other area, you want to make sure your staff is fully trained. If the FAD is not doing the R2T4s, make sure that the person who is completely trained on that. A good tool is the FSA assessments on IFAP. Go ahead and access that. It tells you everything you need to know about R2T4 calculations, where the regs are, where the resources are, etc. Also, I have found that schools are not necessarily, this is infrequent, but they're not necessarily using the department's form, or they're not using our actual tool, the on-FSA access to CPS online. They're using homegrown forms. Try and stay away from that. Sometimes those are missing elements that are required in the calculation. And if you're automated, if you're a banner school, a data tell school, make sure that your process is set up correctly. As you know, one small field that's incorrect could cause a systemic miscalculation of R2T4s, so make sure your setup is accurate. Finally, R2T4s, unfortunately, it's a dollar-for-dollar return to the department, both Pell and loans. So if we do have R2T4 calculation errors, we will require the school to return those funds to the department. Creates an AR, and schools do not like ARs. I know my VP hated ARs, so you don't want any accounts receivables. Okay, next slide. The next two slides are in reference to the Clery Act requirements that are in place with the department. First one being the drug abuse prevention program requirements not met. Unfortunately, these findings are fairly systemic at most of the schools that we visit. I would say myself personally, I maybe have had one or two schools that did not have a finding with the Clery area. So this really needs to be attended to and made sure that your school is compliant in the drug abuse prevention and the crime awareness requirements area. I've been to schools that don't have a drug abuse prevention program. They just don't have it. I've been to schools that don't distribute the drug and alcohol program to students on an annual basis, students and employees both. Make sure that you have a compliant program and that it is distributed. You can send an email to all students and employees with a hyperlink, and that does work. Most schools do go ahead and distribute it that way. Secondary to that is the biannual review. This is an area that most schools do tend to come up deficient with, and you have to conduct a biannual review to determine the efficiency of the program and the effectiveness. You have to include the data and the methods used to support those conclusions. So by data, you can gather data by tracking the number of drug and alcohol-related disciplinary actions. If you have a counseling area, you can track that data, the number of students who are actually seeking active counseling. And you can also use the incidences reported by campus police, if you have that, or off-campus officials in reference to drug-related incidents. So you can collect that data for your biannual review. Another thing that we recommend, and it's useful, is to go ahead and conduct a survey of students and employees to get a feeling for what the drug and alcohol situation is on campus. You can survey students and employees to determine how many of them are in self-help, how many are seeking counseling, how do they rate and evaluate the problem on campus, how significant is it, or is it under control. The drug and alcohol prevention program requirements, once again, are on IFAP and FSA assessments. Please go ahead and take a look at those. It gives you, once again, everything you need to know to create a compliant drug and alcohol prevention program. It's in Consumer Information under Activity Bar 2. A recommendation that I've said before is to have a qualified staff member who actually handles the drug and alcohol abuse prevention program. Get someone in to become an expert on that program. That person should develop relationships with interested parties and get those lines of communication active and flowing. And finally, it is important to note that the drug abuse and crime awareness findings are referred to our Clery group in the department for review. And if the finding stands, unfortunately, our administrative actions and appeals group can administer a fine for these findings. All right, next slide. Crime awareness requirements not met. As Cassandra mentioned, this is the #1 finding now in program reviews. The requirements are comprehensive. There's a lot of things that you have to have in your crime awareness report. So once again, FSA assessments has everything you need. I think it's beneficial to have a policy and procedure around the crime awareness requirements. Make it part of your manual. Include the date that it's due, October 1st. Include the staff member or the responsibility chain that's involved. Go ahead and talk about the lines of communication. Who do I need involved? Who do I need to speak to? What data do I have to collect? What are the components? Make sure all the components are covered. So go ahead and I recommend going ahead and including that in a policy and procedures manual. The crime awareness report is due by October 1st of each year. It has to be published, and students and employees have to be notified of its availability. It's important to note that if a student, or part of the notification requirements is if a student or employee starts after October 1st, but within that current award year, they have to also be informed. You can't just do one blast on October 1st. You have to make sure that those students and employees are also advised. Examples of missing required components includes schools sometimes will omit the crime notification and reporting policy and procedures. Students and employees have to be aware of how they report those incidences. The crime awareness report requires quite a bit of statistics, and those statistics include categories. Some schools have omitted certain categories that are required. These include hate crime category, larceny, and other categories. So make sure all the categories are reported. There may be a bunch of zeros on the form, that's fine, but you have to include all the categories and all the numbers of incidents. In the annual security report, we have to see the full geography of your school. In other words, if you're a large institution with a large campus and additional locations, we need the campus. We need to see for the statistics, the campus, the additional locations. If you have on-campus dormitories, we need to see statistics regarding incidences within those dormitories. Non-campus buildings and property where students meet and have either some of the social groups, et cetera, that has to be included, and adjacent and accessible public property. All that has to be included in the statistics. Many schools are leaving that out. Another component is description of programs designed to inform about crime prevention. You have to have something on campus that actually instructs and advises students and employees about prevention. Timely warnings and emergency notifications. You need to have those in there, and you have to have a testing procedure. And if you do have dormitories on campus, you can include, or it can be separate, fire safety information. If you include it in the annual security report, it has to be titled with both elements. And fire safety includes appliance, smoking, open flames, etc. The Violence Against Women Act provisions were made effective in 2014. This is also a requirement now in the crime awareness report. You have to include a number of different elements in that report. One of those are procedures for campus disciplinary action in cases of offenses. And with that, you have to make sure that the community knows that the accuser and the accused are entitled to the same opportunities to have others present during a disciplinary proceeding. There's a number of requirements. IFAP, FSA assessments list those. Once again, these crime awareness requirements are referred to our Clery group, and fine action can be brought by our Administrative Appeals and Services group. I also want to make a quick note that Jim Moore, who is the director of our Clery area, has two presentations today, one at 11:40 in room 401, and then one later this afternoon at 2:50. So if you want more detailed information about Clery, I advise you to go ahead and take in that session. Now I have almost no time left, but let me quickly go over repeat findings. This is mainly in the audit area. When a school has identical findings cited from one year to the next or multiple years in a row, that is a repeat finding. When we have repeat findings, we require schools to create corrective actions. Corrective actions can be tailored to your school. There's no set template or standard for that. It can be created based on your staffing, your operational structure, et cetera. I do have an example, but I think I'm going to skip that because we're getting a little late. But if you do have repeat findings, make sure your internal controls are complete, ensure that staff are properly trained, perform those quality assurance checks, make sure that that's being put under wraps, that you have that under control. And if you find that you still don't have it under control, make the necessary changes that you need to in order to regain compliance. It's important for me to note once again that repeat findings are something that the department pays special attention to and is part of our decision making in having us friendly folks come out and do a program review. So repeat findings is another thing that you really want to be careful about. With that, I'm going to transfer over to Cassandra for wrap up. Thank you.
Okay, family, thank you again for coming and gracing us with your presence to hear about program review, processing, and also the compliance audit findings. You know, we're here as resources. So if you ever have a question, you're in doubt about anything, just pick up the phone and call your case management office and inquire if you're not sure about something. At this time, we're going to open the floor up for questions. There are mics in the center. We would ask that you come to the mic so we can hear your question. And if we run out of time, if you still have a question, then we can address that individually up here in the front.
I just have a quick question. Regarding the conversation about SAP, when we talked about mitigating circumstances and what qualifies as a mitigating circumstance, so I just want to make sure I heard that correctly. You're specifically stating that a student who had a work issue where their schedule changed and they no longer were able to attend classes regularly as they originally expected, or possibly had some type of transportation issue, those would not be, in your opinion, considered a mitigating circumstance or special circumstance, since it's not defined.
Right, correct. It's not defined. However, in your policy, most schools will say a student can successfully appeal because of mitigating circumstance, and they give an example.
Okay.
So you would say something like mitigating circumstances, example, car accident, I've seen that, or death in
Right.
the family, something like that.
But
So
if it's not defined, that would be
It should be
considered a
defined.
finding if we don't define the types of other mitigating circumstances
Well,
outside of what
usually
is in the
it's
handbook?
car accident or illness or other. It's
Right.
usually, so that student could fall under the other category,
Okay,
depending
so as long as
on,
we use an other category, we
Right.
should be okay. Okay.
I always think of mitigating as out of a student's control.
Okay.
Yeah,
I just
that's-
wanted to make sure, because we do have situations with work schedules at our schools that we have used for SAP appeals, and we've accepted work schedule conflicts as a reason for why they weren't successful. So that's why I was wondering. No?
I can't say yes or no to that, but usually mitigating circumstance, if you define it as a car accident or illness, a
Okay.
work schedule would not, I would have to see it.
Okay.
But I
'Cause
don't
there's
know if that
different
would be a
reasons.
mitigating circumstance, because
Okay.
that's not out of the student's control.
So out of the student's control is probably a really good measure.
We're
for
shaking
us
our
to
heads,
use.
so you may want to go back and look at that.
Okay.
I've got two R2T4 questions. One, under other educational related fees, would orientation fees that say we charge to all freshmen and/or all transfer students, so anytime a student comes into the university, they're charged the orientation fee, is that something we can include as institutional charges?
Yes.
Okay. Number two, concerning the 5-day break. We have a spring break that's 5 days, so weekends on either side, but the weekends are not considered part of that spring break, so there are classes that can occur on those Saturdays and Sundays. So in that case, we wouldn't include those weekends as part of that break, correct?
I've had this question in my previous sessions. My initial take on that is that classes are regularly scheduled on Saturdays and Sundays for, not just for certain cohorts or certain programs, for students in general. Can you give me your card? I'm going to research this a little more thoroughly. We never want to say anything that, isn't
Okay.
completely correct.
Sure.
And then I'll email you after I do the research and talk to management. I'm not 100%, I'm about 95%, but not 100% sure on that.
Okay. Sure.
Typically, you do need to include both weekends.
Hello. I have a question regarding verification findings and in regards to our requirement to resolve conflicting information. So we have to use the wage and income transcript a lot of times because we have a lot of students who have multiple W-2s and they lose some of them, or who knows what they do with them. So they tend to request the wage and income transcript for that. On the wage and income transcript, there is a line that says deferred compensation. However, it does not indicate what code it is. Is that considered conflicting information, and do we need to ask for the original W-2 in order to resolve that?
I don't think the original W-2 is needed, and unless it's something that conflicts, like if that line item, you could tell what it was, and then somewhere else in the file, there's a different figure for that particular thing, then there wouldn't be anything that would actually conflict. If that's considered part of the income, and that is not included in the total amount of income that you're listing for the student on the ICER, that's where the conflict comes from.
Right, it's the untaxed income,
So it is part of the student's income.
Right, so if, for instance, on the ICER, they had left it blank, and then there's something on that line on the wage and income transcript, would that be conflicting?
Yes.
Okay, so then, in that case, we would have to ask for the original
If you're not sure of
W-2
what that
to find
is,
the
and
code.
yes, it's going to conflict with something else in the file, yes.
Okay, yeah, we've been trying to figure out if it's only specific codes that show there, because beneath it has QWS laid out separately, but we haven't been able to get an answer to that so far, so.
And I know there are a lot of times, like if you maybe call the IRS, they can tell you what exactly those codes mean.
That's our plan.
And then that way you can actually be able to document the student's file to show that maybe that is not something that should be included in the information you have in the student's file, so it wouldn't be conflicting. But you would need to make sure that you have that documentation in the student's file.
Okay, thank you.
Okay?
Hi, my question is about the last day of classes versus finals week. We have a finals week, but our students self-schedule their exams, so we've been counting the last day as the last day of classes because there's no set last day of finals week. You know, a student can schedule all their exams and just leave, basically. So I just wanted to clarify, make sure we're doing that correctly.
All right, you don't have in your calendar, you don't have a notation for finals week.
We do, but the students can take an exam 3 a.m. in the library. You know, they self-schedule them whenever they want. So they can leave at any point once they finish their exams.
Well, that applies across the board. Schools with final weeks, one student might have all their finals on Monday, but we still say go ahead and use the last day of finals week as the end of the payment period. So,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, thank you.
Good morning. I'm currently going through a state audit myself, and the First Lady's question regarding the Saturday classes, the state auditors have asked me that same very question that I've been trying to research direct. So can I give you my business card if you can give me that?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, in regards to the R2T4 calculation and tuition and fees, sorry, my voice is really bad right now. For institutional charges, we have in advance of sometimes students getting a refund check, they'll ask to buy books or whatnot, and so we give them kind of campus bucks stuff. The intention is for them to use that for books, but they can use it for pretty much any expense on campus, like food or whatnot. Do we need to include that, or is that excluded?
No, that would not be. It really pertains to a bookstore voucher that
Purely for books, and that's it?
correct.
Okay,
Correct.
Thank you.
My question is regarding R2T4 and the use of credit or clock hour. We have programs in our New York campus that are accredited as semester credit and are only recognized by the state of New York as clock hour. They're not, the clock hours are not a requirement for any certification whatsoever. So my understanding is of July 1st, they are considered semester credit hours or semester credit programs by the Department of Education, not clock hour programs, for the dispersing of aid and for the calculation of R2T4. Am I correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Hello. I'd like some clarification on SAP, regarding SAP, when a student appeals, and depending on the environment that the student is raised. For instance, a student who lives in a single-parent home, and the student has been forced to take on extra hours at work, can document the difference between the number of hours that their parent is sick and they had to take on different hours, increase their hours, and then now they're appealing and indicating that they have now changed their jobs. They can document the difference in the hours and therefore believe that they can successfully complete this semester. Would that be acceptable if we have that written in our policies, that they need to document the illness of the parent, for example, the number of hours that they had previously, and the change in the number of hours they currently have?
Yes, anytime there's an illness of a student's parent and that student is the primary caregiver for that student, then something like that, and that student had to do additional hours, that sounds like it could be a reason for an SAP appeal.
Okay, thank you.
I also just want to say that the other question that was asked, I think this is why we said it would be something we would have to actually look at. Because we can't just say, just because your hours at work change, that is a mitigating circumstance. But there may be something else that caused your hours to change. So it would be a case-by-case basis, as mitigating circumstances sometimes are.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no more questions, again, we thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference.